This is my new favourite lens for the Arctic. It's not just for stars and not just for auroras. It's also a creative lens choice when you want to do something a little bit different with landscape photography. This review of the 14mm f1.4 from Sigma is not going to deal at all with astrophotography. There are loads of great videos on that already, produced by people who understand a lot more about the topic than I do. My expertise is with auroras and landscapes in the frozen Arctic. And for that, this Sigma Prime lens is an absolute treat. It's my new favourite lens to pack for adventures in the far north. Let's dig into each of the reasons why I love this lens. This lens is a gorgeous bit of kit for chasing auroras, and for many reasons. I want to share with you a handful of time-lapse sequences that I captured with this lens, so you can see for yourself why I find it so exciting. The three reasons this lens is so well suited to aurora photography are the rotating collar, the lack of vignetting, and being able to push faster than f2.8 while still capturing a super wide sky. Thinking about everything this lens does, the price tag is really so much more reasonable than I could have expected. The street price at the moment is around about $1,500 USD. That is excellent value. All of the stills here were captured on the Lumix S5 Mark II, typically at the sweet spot of ISO 4000, where the higher ISO circuit takes over. Beyond that, I'm simply mixing up the f-stop and shutter speeds to fine-tune my exposures. On my most recent journey in Arctic Norway, I found myself comparing this 14mm prime to Sigma's older 14 to 24mm f2.8 zoom. So imagine now you're shooting in the dark and the auroras are dancing so fast that you really want to keep the exposure length to a minimum. If you've got a lens that's at 2.8 and a lens that's at f2, you've got a big difference here. The difference is between exposing for 2 seconds versus exposing for 8 seconds. Now, on a gentle night, you can totally get away with those 8-second exposures, or even slower. But there are times when the aurora just moves so fast in the sky, and even at 2 seconds, you're going to lose a little of the definition in the ribbons. So being able to drop the aperture down to f2, instead of having to bump the shutter to 8 seconds, is a major advantage. It's also a big win if you want to capture a time-lapse sequence with super smooth results. Assembling from 2-second exposures is kind of the sweet spot when it comes to aurora time-lapse. You get lots of detail, but you're also not slowing down the aurora too much. Auroras are super fickle things to chase in the Arctic. You need good weather on the night, plus the right conditions in space to generate the aurora event. A lot of things have to be just right in order for you to be standing underneath a beautiful show of the Northern Lights. So when it happens, I just want to be ready and have the best possible lens on my camera to capture it with. Some super clever engineers in Japan worked super hard to put this lens together. They managed to design a gorgeous 14mm ultra-wide, but with a fast f1.4 aperture. And yet, despite all this technology, my favourite feature is the little rotating collar. It's not even a part of the lens technically, it's completely optional whether to attach it or not. For me, the collar is anything but optional, though it is essential to getting the best value from this lens. Firstly, the collar has an Arca-Swiss compatible foot, so that fits directly onto any of my tripods without having to mount an additional plate. I like that. Second, this collar helps to center the weight when you are loading onto your tripod head. Most cameras are pretty modest compared to this lens, but the main win with this collar is how easily I can switch my setup from landscape to portrait while chasing an aurora. This was something I used over and over again. My approach to aurora photography is usually to have 2 cameras ready. I set one up to capture the time lapse with a pretty bit of landscape, and then I use the other to chase compositions in the sky as the aurora moves about. And let me tell you, they really do move about. An aurora might start off low in the northwest before stretching directly overhead and making an arc from one horizon to the other, literally above your head. This is why 14mm is so important, and 24mm is just not nearly wide enough for the Northern Lights in Tromsø. It's also why having the ability to super quickly switch from landscape to portrait is a huge win. Even with a 14mm lens, I'm never going to capture the full story of an aurora. It's bigger than both of us. But I like having options for composition. Sometimes I want to pull in a little bit of foreground and capture a modest aurora in between two mountains, say. But then sometimes I want to reach up from the horizon and grab a little bit of the sky right above my head. 14mm in portrait lets me do that. When the auroras are going big in Tromsø, I don't want to be fiddling around with L brackets or remounting a camera. Even in the dark, I can quickly unlock the collar, confidently spin around my camera and start tweaking my compositions. Equally stunning for travellers to the far north are the frozen landscapes and fjords. I just love the Arctic in winter, and especially on those days when we get a little bit of sunlight coming across the landscape. Here again, the 14mm F1.4 proved to be a winner, at least for someone who enjoys the craft of working landscapes with such a wide lens. One thing I have observed from 2 decades of running photography tours is that many people really struggle to tame an ultra-wide lens. It's not always intuitive to work so wide. If you are one of those people who tried it for your landscape photography and just didn't feel the love, then you're not alone. This is one reason I always make a point of looking for suitable opportunities on my tours to demonstrate the essence of good ultra-wide photography, because it really is a different way to think about composition. Once you get the hang of how it does work, 14mm becomes a lot more enjoyable. The key is to push your foreground. We often get caught up with focusing on the grandeur of a big landscape scene, and we tend to forget about the first metre or so that's right in front of us. But that is where a 14mm landscape is won or lost. That detail in the foreground is not only critical to good composition, but it's where an ultra-wide lens really shines. Typically, we're talking about very small details, as in physically small things. Small rocks, a little grass, a puddle of water, or maybe a bit of ice. Scale gets thrown out of scale by the 14mm perspective. Little things up close become enormous and powerful, which is why the foreground is where composition really takes place. But, plot twist, normally when we capture an ultra-wide landscape scene, the objective is to ensure every inch of the frame is inside your depth of field. We typically want sharpness from edge to edge, but what happens if you throw all that in the opposite direction instead? Skinny landscapes are what happens when you shoot wide open and let your foreground turn silky soft. This effect creates a sense of depth, and it makes it clear to the audience where their eyes should be landing. That one detail on the horizon that falls in focus becomes a tiny, teeny hero to the scene. This is my skinny landscape technique. Normally, I would do this stuff with a 50mm lens, and the faster the better. My last trip to Norway was the very first time I've had the chance to try the same technique with such a wide lens that is so fast. This was tons of fun. There were times when the distortion effect from such a wide perspective was greater than I wanted. You have to watch what happens in the corners with this sort of lens. It's not easy, but it's a great result when you get it right. The fundamentals of shooting skinny landscapes in some ways is very similar to fat landscapes. You're reaching for balance between the foreground and the background. You want them to connect. I'm not just putting something fuzzy in front of the scene for the sake of bokeh. It has to be a valid element of the scene. It has to make sense. My favourite moments are usually when that low Arctic light is pouring directly into the lens and tripping over some of the foreground bokeh. Bringing all those elements together makes me happy. And there's an extra benefit to shooting wide open in these sunny situations. Flaring caused by sunlight bouncing off the glass can be somewhat distracting at apertures around f8. But as you go wider and faster, those flares get softer and gentler. They melt into the scene instead of digging in their nails. I know all of this seems highly unconventional and probably contradicts at least half of the advice you've received in Camera Club over the years. But it's a lot of fun, and it's only possible with a unique lens like this one. I really don't like to get caught up with the tech specs of lenses. I care mostly about the minimum f-stop and which mounts they're sold in. It actually made me laugh to run through the technical reviews for this lens. The only genuine criticism seems to be that it's heavy and expensive. And I got to say, both of those claims are exaggerated. This is not only a superb bit of glass, but superb value. You get what you pay for here. It's not a compact lens, but I am frequently surprised by the expectation that a lens should be super light and super small. I think we've all been spoiled rotten by some of the cheaper and slower lenses made for the mirrorless systems. Well, this lens is the opposite. It is over-engineered to achieve a level of optical quality that I simply never dreamed of as a young fella trying to learn photography, let alone that it might sell for less than $1,500 USD. Yes, it is bigger than most of my other lenses. No, it's not remotely difficult to pack into my camera bag. And no, none of my other lenses can do what this lens can. I have to give this lens some extra bonus points for being rugged too. Late in my Arctic journey, I had a nasty little accident with a tripod that saw my Lumix camera and Sigma lens go tumbling across some very jagged rocks. Both were deeply scarred, along with my right leg. My leg eventually got better, but the camera and lens have both sustained permanent wounds from the incident. Neither, however, stopped shooting, and I was able to continue taking shots of my auroras over the next week. In fact, my most treasured aurora moments from this particular winter were captured on the busted up version of my 14mm f1.4. It's been doing the job just fine despite the heavy knock. Much of my appreciation for this 14mm prime comes from already being an owner of the Sigma 14-24 f2.8. Indeed, until now, that Sigma zoom was my preferred Aurora lens. I had them both side by side for this journey, so comparing the two was unavoidable. You just don't see vignetting on this 14mm prime. It's remarkably bright edge to edge. There's not a heap of vignetting on the 14-24 either, but you can spot the difference between these two under certain conditions. Interestingly, more than half of my group on this year's Norway tour were also shooting on the Sigma 14-24mm f2.8. It is a killer good lens because it does a great job with auroras, but also delivers great flexibility for landscape work. It's a lens I'm quick to recommend for anyone heading to the Arctic. A unique feature of the Sigma zoom lens is a rear slot that accepts very small filters. You can buy specially sized ND filters that pop into the rear groove out of harm's way and hence negate the issue of trying to adapt large glass filters to a curved front of the lens. If you already have a set of these filters for the Sigma 14-24mm, then you'll be pleased to know the same filters will slot into the 14mm prime as well. So that's a bonus. These are two very different lenses. The Sigma zoom doesn't have the rotating collar and it is a bit smaller and lighter to pack than the prime. In my case, I want two cameras and two lenses for Aurora Chasing in the Arctic. So I'll be packing both of these lenses until something better comes along. That's all I have to say about the gorgeous 14mm f1.4 from Sigma. If you want to learn more about auroras in the Arctic or deep dive into my packing list for expeditions to the north, please check out some of my other videos here. I try to share my inspiration and information both here and on my website. Feel free to track me down at ewanbell.com and have a great day.